There's a lot of people here, but Donna and I will continue to go through the chat. And Zoom is always kind of a little bit awkward, but at times we'll interject and we'll ask Annalise questions. So without further ado, we'd like to introduce Annalise Himes.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. It's really, it's amazing actually to get to feel like we're really getting to connect. You know, this book has been a many-year project, a labor of love, and I've gotten to interact with a number of you over Facebook and really gotten to be a part of this vibrant community, and I'm so grateful for that. And you know, one of the sad things about having my book come out at the still during the pandemic is that you know, I don't get to do those in-person book talks and the bookstore visits, and it's such a special time to actually get to interact with people, shake their hands, and you know, I just appreciate the opportunity to get a virtual experience with that here. And also, thank you to Dara and Donna for setting up the personalized book plate giveaway that they have on Facebook. If you haven't seen that yet, it's on the group, and it gives me an opportunity to actually like write your name, write a little message, mail it to you, and get some of that, again, approximation that we don't get to have in person at this moment. So no, thanks
for doing that. So Donna, do you want to kick off the first?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just unmuted.
No, Donna's the gatekeeper.
Yes, I am. So we did a video with you before, and we shared it on our YouTube channel about why you Maj. But we just wanted to know what brought you to the game of Mahjong and how that led your aunt's question that sparked your book.
Yes, absolutely. So for those who haven't seen that, this project was really sparked by a beloved aunt. Actually, I'm lucky enough to have my father and my sister here on this Zoom call right now, and it's my father's sister, and my sister's aunt as well, and my niece's great aunt, and we and Jane was a really special person in all of our lives. But one of the reasons that I begin the story with her is because she is a big part of why I wrote this book. My partner and I were living in China for a year teaching English before I began my PhD program at Stanford. And I knew I was interested in Chinese history. I knew I was interested in going to focus on American history. And so I was interested in crossover between these two cultures. And my aunt just asked, she visited us while we were living there. We were in southwestern China, and Mahjong was everywhere, and it was played by lots of different people. It was young and old. You know, we had retirees playing in the parks, young waiters and waitresses playing in alleys during their break. Of course, families play it during Chinese New Year. So it was really everywhere. And she knew already that it was a Chinese game, but she grew up she wasn't Jewish, but in a strongly Jewish part of Denver, Colorado. And a lot of her friends a lot of her friends' mothers rather played Mahjong in the 1950s and 60s. So she grew up hearing about it, being around it, and knew it was a strong part of Jewish American women's culture. Well, then when she visited us, she then had, she was exercising regularly at the JCC in the same part of Denver, and a lot of her friends then played Mahjong as adults. So she just asked, you know, why do my Jewish friends play this Chinese game? And I thought, this is probably something I can find on Google, right? And in fact, I just, you know, did a little bit of internet searching, and it was clear a lot of people had asked that question, but no one had actually done the scholarly research to find out. And there were a lot of theories, a lot of misinformation. And so I kind of filed that away. I'm like, this is a very interesting, intriguing story. I wonder what the answer is. But when I started graduate school, I didn't think I was going to write my dissertation and eventually my book on Mahjong. But during my second research seminar, I just scratched the surface of the historical record, because my wonderful advisor, who was very supportive, and actually was a Jewish woman herself, said, you know, this is a very interesting topic, but there's got to be sources. is there a there? You have to have the evidence. And so this seems like something that's, there's no archive for Mahjong. So are you going to be able to get this evidence? And so I just scratched the surface, again, looking for this particular connection, thinking about the 1950s and 60s, and it became clear that there was this enormous international fad driven by this huge American explosion of interest in the game in the 1920s, and hundreds of newspaper articles alone about this fad. And this was before, the wonderful museum exhibit Project Mahjong. Some of you may have seen that as it traveled around the country. This is before any of that. So no one was talking about the 1920s fad. And it was clear this was a really important piece of that puzzle. And that, yes, there was definitely a there. So I picked it up and ran with it and haven't looked back.
That's great. So just like you said about a scholarly, Donna and I are really enjoying reading the book. And what's amazing about it is all the footnotes and all the quotations and citations you have, but it doesn't read like that at all. I mean, it reads like a novel, which is just so lovely. So that being said, and I know you can't go, we are limited on time, so I know you can't go into the entire detail, but can you give a quick version of the history of the game in China?
Yes, and I do want to shout out, just in response to that comment, I believe I saw the name of my wonderful editor, Susan Ferber from Oxford, is on this call, and she deserves a lot of credit for also helping me translate an academic dissertation. Although I always tried to write it in a more narrative style, she definitely helped me.
Yeah,
also
Susan is on right now.
Okay, thank you, Susan.
But she can't.
So
she said it's a team effort.
Okay. She's very generous. So in a nutshell, as you know, right, there's a book I wrote on it, so I'll just try to be very brief. The short version is that Mahjong was developed in the mid to late 19th century, late 1800s in China, in the area around Shanghai. It becomes one of many male gambling games, predominantly, not exclusively male gambling games. It becomes a really important part of courtesan culture in Shanghai. And also the Empress Dowager at the end of the Qing dynasty in Beijing, her court takes it up. She takes it up in the early 20th century, before the Republican Revolution in China. And so it's spreading. There's interest, but it's still, again, one of many games. And at the same time, there's a growing American presence in China, increasingly businessmen, as opposed to before, it was mostly missionaries. And there's a businessman named Joseph Babcock, and he is there with Standard Oil. And he, unusually, many Americans there never learned Chinese. He did. And he learned probably a local dialect. I'm not sure exactly, but he was able to communicate with people. He learned Mahjong in that time. And a lot of people on this call have probably heard his name, have probably heard of the Mahjong Sales Company of America. In the beginning of my research, I had heard a lot of chatter about him. I knew he was a big self-promoter. So I kind of wanted to push against this, right? Is this really true? Is he really the most important person? And, was pretty skeptical of that, because so much of this was about advertising and marketing. And I became convinced over many years of research that he was certainly never the only person involved in the marketing of Mahjong, but he really is probably the most important person in this story of bringing it to the United States. He and his wife and his business associates help launch a business that becomes a huge fad in the 1920s. So in the early 1920s, it takes over American popular culture. There's plays, songs, and clothes that have to do with Mahjong. It's really everywhere. Spanish language newspapers are talking about it in Texas, and small town newspapers in Nebraska. And it becomes quickly associated with a game of the elite white culture, but in reality, everyone was talking about or playing this game. it was also really explicitly marketed as an exotic good. So I'm sure we'll talk more about later. I encourage you to read the book. I go into a lot of detail about the marketing that I won't cover right this second. But suffice it to say, there was a real performative aspect to it. And one of the most common things was that you had white women dressing up in Chinese costume in order to play the game. And it was really part of this whole performative aspect. Fad dies out, fads do. And also I make arguments in the book about why maybe culturally the fad died out, but pockets of players remained. It's a good game, as we all know, and people continue playing it. And one of those pockets involved Air Force officers' wives in the early 1940s that then become a really important and unique American variant, the Wright-Patterson type of play. If you are a Wright-Pat player, put your little emoji in your screen for your, you can get some representation here. And also in the late 1930s, the National Mahjong League was founded in New York by mostly Jewish American women. And they create the National Mahjong League's version of the game that they call National Mahjong, today is known as American Mahjong. And that really becomes the most widespread American version of the game that now is also played in other parts of the world, but is called American Mahjong. Right. And that story takes off in the 1950s and 60s, really led by young mothers who were increasingly living in increasingly suburban contexts, and also still having shared patterns of certain vacationing rhythms, beach clubs, the Catskills, of course, being very, very important and influential in creating patterns of leisure that unusually Jewish women brought then back into their homes in an era when mothers were really seen as the most important job that they could be doing would be actively mothering and housewifery. Mahjong becomes a way to integrate a little bit of girls' own leisure, right? This is the girls' night out, of rotating between each other's homes, the Mahjong ladies. This is a very, very important and cohesive part of the culture and Mahjong culture, and part of why it becomes such an important piece of Jewish American women's culture.
Well, going back to Joseph Babcock in the 1920s, how do you think he walked a fine line with the game being associated with China and then presenting it as a brand new game in America? You know,
yes, he did. He struggled with that. He didn't always walk it well. This question is coming from the context of he's bringing it to the United States. He initially markets it as this is an authentic Chinese game, and importantly talks about it as this ancient game, right? It very quickly, he's not actually the biggest person who does this, other competing marketers, but they all emphasize this kind of ancient mystique, and that taps into stereotypes of Chinese culture. And at the same time, as the game becomes very quickly, wildly popular, there's more and more and more competition. And he is struggling to assert proprietary ownership over the game. And so he sues people, he tries to get a patent on the game. And throughout each of those moves, he's having to position himself as somehow uniquely able to own this game. He did, we think, as best we can tell, he did make some changes to the way that the game is played, some rules. So he did genuinely make some changes. They're not hugely different. It's definitely still was a recognizable form of the Chinese game. And so at one point, he actually, in trying to fight off a main competitor of the Peng Chau company, he says, this is actually, I made the whole thing up. This is my game. You can't have it. And that sparked an outcry among young Chinese Americans who rarely had the opportunity to be taken seriously, especially if they were speaking out against this, very wealthy white businessman, and saying, but they were taken seriously, saying, no, you do not get to claim this. This is a Chinese game. And he actually also quickly backtracked because he realized he wanted to sell it as a Chinese game because that was seen as exotic. So he was certainly, you can see a little bit of inconsistencies in his approach.
And then it also seems along that line that a lot of the marketing was saying that it was a game as old as Confucius. And the marketing was so it seems like you touched on it in the beginning that there was Chinese costumes, but there were also even the department stores, their whole layout, and the women that sold were dressed up in Chinese. Can you give some examples of some of the Asian culture that was intertwined with Mahjong?
Yes, absolutely. It was very important to the mostly white marketers who were actively trying to create this American Mahjong market. And then this is also, again, spreading to other parts of the world. So Europe and England is also having very similar type fads and similar type marketing campaigns that echo the American approach. And it's sold as an exotic good. And so what that rests on is a widely held popular notion that is based on stereotypes of Chinese culture, a real simplified version that also associates it with, as you point out, as I talk about in the book, specifically Confucius, in part because Confucius was perhaps the only Chinese name that most Americans were familiar with, but also because specifically, right, this was an esteemed figure. This is an ancient and eminently respectable philosopher. And so it's in the context of the 1920s when there is an enormous amount of anti-Chinese and anti-Asian sentiment that was very, very normalized, right? That was a pervasive part of American culture. And so in order to make a Chinese good so appealing, there was an active distancing on the part of marketers, some more than others. Again, Babcock's actually not doing that as much as some others are, particularly LL Haar with Peng Chau. And they're actively saying, this is about Confucius, this is about an ancient game of the Mandarins. It's not about modern day Chinese and Chinese American people. Those were not the terms that they were using, but they were saying it's not about people we're trying to exclude from with our immigration laws. It's about this ancient esteemed culture that's degraded now. And so throughout almost every aspect of the 1920s fad, it is enmeshed with representations of Chinese culture and what's called Orientalism, or which is basically a mishmash of pulling things from the Near and Far East. It begins with ideas about the Middle East. It extends then to ideas of the Far East. And it kind of pulls these things together and says, well, these are all these misty foreign cultures that have certain, we assume, certain shared characteristics. It's a really problematic set of ideas. Still, we see some of the legacies today. It was a predominant set of ideas at the time. This was widely kind of understood. And so there wasn't a whole lot of representations of actual Chinese culture or actual Asian cultures in these advertising. There was a ton of stereotyped representation. And some of that was quite explicitly racist and hostile. Some of it was not. Some of it was simply a kind of Art Deco era Asian aesthetic influenced.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Wasn't it even like Erte? I always forget how to pronounce it.
Yes.
How he designed the costumes for a ballet. So
exactly. Yes. For those who don't know, Erte is a really iconic, very famous Art Deco designer. His work is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I went to the archives of the Met to look at his Mahjong prints, which was wonderful. And so, yes, certainly in that moment you have Art Deco partially was part of this larger Orientalist aesthetic moment. And so it's complicated, right? It's not all one thing or all the other, but it is not resting on a genuine kind of engagement with especially modern Asian culture and Asian people. but it is very widely understood to be a Chinese game and consumed as such.
And there were parties where it was themed outfits and ballets and
Yeah.
music, all based on the.
Yes, in fact, garden plays, right? People had hosted garden plays that were written where people would occupy different roles of the game, and so we see that. But then the text of the play, when you read it, oftentimes that has them speaking in kind of stilted, caricatured speech. So again, in the 1920s, there was not an awareness, a widespread awareness of the problems of stereotyped and racist culture, right? So it's very, very intermixed. And you also have things, as you're saying, parties where people are just hosting. One of the smart ladies, the things that smart ladies do is host these Oriental parties. And so people can come and they can be wearing, again, a kind of pastiche of ideas of Asian inspired costumes. And they also then would eat like avocado, which was also associated with California, which is becoming very sexy at this time, and avocado stuffed with ginger. Right? That has nothing to do with Chinese cuisine, but it is, again, this kind of mix of these elements that felt culturally relevant to someone who was not actually interacting with.
But as we talked about before the call started, we were saying how department stores marketed it. And probably, in advertisements and storefront windows, they marketed the costumes, the clothes, the parties. And that was part of the culture, and no one thought it was wrong,
Right. And what's interesting is, what's hard is that, in fact, Asian Americans at the time were speaking out against that, but their voices were really drowned out. So some of these department stores, what you would see is them actually like posing Asian Americans in the window as a kind of live show, and a Chinese American young college graduate who may have gotten a degree in English or engineering could not find a job except to put on a costume and work in a curio shop. That is what they were seen as good for, and as what their talents could extend to. So they were writing and saying, I hate this. I don't want to do this, but it's all I can get a job in. But the people, a white consumer walking by that store window is not having that conversation with them, right? They don't know. And that voice of the person experiencing it is not getting publicized or brought to a broader audience.
Right. So you talked about your research and the access you had to different scrapbooks, private collections, and interviews. We just want to know, can you share what scrapbooks you had access to and what it was like to go through these and find images and articles?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I really appreciate you asking about the research process, because it's such
just amazed us looking at all the citations. It really. Yeah.
I appreciate hearing that.
Sarah and I are both lawyers, so we had to write a lot with footnotes, and so we like seeing that.
I appreciate hearing that, because sometimes you hear, the public doesn't want all these citations, you should cut them out. But I think, I know this world, people want to actually be able to find what you're talking about. And I know
Abraham Lincoln said you can't always believe everything you see on the internet. So,
Exactly. So, as I mentioned before, there's no archive for Mahjong. So this is really like a needle in a haystack type approach. I just cast an enormous net and tried to hunt down every little trail I could. And so that took me to a lot of interesting places, and I met a lot of interesting people. And I had no idea that these incredibly rich scrapbooks even existed. But I did eventually. So one place, the really important one, was the scrapbooks from the Mahjong Sales Company. And so of the early 1920s, and then there were two after Babcock sold the rights to Parker Brothers and they became partners. Then there's a second scrapbook for each of those eras. So I can show you the covers if you want.
Yeah,
that'd be great.
I
Okay.
love
that. So this is
I know there's always a delay with sharing. Okay.
There it is.
Oh, wait.
Oh, wow.
that didn't work.
Advertising and publicity.
Did it work?
Yeah,
Yep.
Mahjong
Okay.
Sales Company of America.
Okay, great. So this is the first one. And inside of it are pages like, I will share again. So this is the first thing that you see, which is actually a business card of inside the scrapbook. And much of the scrapbook were literally clippings of every newspaper article reference. So at the time, some of you may already know this, there were clipping services. And so the Mahjong Sales Company hired someone to scour these newspapers nationally for any mention of Mahjong. So it was an incredible resource because many of those papers are lost, right? We don't have any records, especially of small town newspapers. We just don't have them. And so to be able to see these articles was wonderful. And then some of them, as I talk about in the book, they were written on, right? There were some little notations. I talk about how there's one where this competitor of LL Har and the Peng Chau company, they launched this whole campaign of like taking down the Mahjong Sales Company. And so they're in this war. And there's a comic where it's titled, a game of Peng Chau, and he goes in there and whites it out and edits it and is like, no, this is so you see this interaction that even if I could have found that newspaper article somewhere, I couldn't have seen his and the company's interactions with it. So that was very, very useful and an amazing feeling. But those two scrapbooks are I don't know where they are now. And this is what is so sad. And I feel so fortunate to have captured a little bit while I could, not knowing it was going to go away. So as you all probably can guess, the games manufacturing company or the games manufacturing industry has struggled to stay in the United States as much manufacturing has. And so we don't have a lot left in the United States. And the Parker Brothers factory is no more. It had been bought out at that time by Hasbro. It's now a Cartamundi factory. But this old factory was still there. And so at the time of Hasbro, and they were actually printing, I walked in and there's the factory floor, the factory workers, there's their lunchroom, right? And you can smell this ink from the Candyland sets or game boards that they're still printing. And I had been in touch with someone. So this is all like the process of finding out these places, right, is long and boring, right? But suffice it to say, I just hunted every single trail I could. And so eventually I sniffed out that this place existed. And I was in touch then with this person who said, well, I have the keys, right? I just keep the keys to this storage room where it's the company archives. And he opened the door and it was just a smell of dust and just stacks of on those metal shelves of 1920 sets wrapped in plastic and tons of paraphernalia over the years of Parker Brothers. And there was a section of it that was Mahjong. Wow. And in there, he just pulled out, okay, well, and then there's a couple of scrapbooks and it was, I opened it and it was just an incredible feeling. And it was early. I mean, it was, this was on a really intense research trip where I was doing tons of oral histories combined with as much archival work as I could because I didn't have a lot of money and I had to travel to get to this place. And so everything was just super condensed. I just had to be really, really efficient. So I'm just madly taking photographs of this scrapbook. And, at the time, I also had no idea, I'm going to maybe use some of these images later. So far down the road, when I actually come to try to include some of these images in the book, I'm like dealing with very old, hastily snapped photographs because try as I might, and I have tried many times to find out what has happened to those scrapbooks, I don't know. That collection was eventually sold in part or donated, I'm not sure, perhaps donated to the Strong Museum of Play in New York, which upstate New York, which surprisingly enough, previous to my research and contacting them repeatedly, had nothing on Mahjong. So I'm happy to say that a lot of that collection is with them, and that's where it should be. That's a great place. But from everything I've heard, the scrapbooks are not included, and so I don't know where they are, and I can't get a hold of anyone else. So I hope that they're out there safe. Somebody knows. The other scrapbook gold mine was when I sniffed out the daughter of Dorothy Meyerson, who's a really important and underknown person in the founding of the National Mahjong League. And her daughter is now named Marjorie Traum. She and I only communicated via letter. And sorry, this is actually my kitten is making a little visit here. But she and I wrote back and forth, and eventually I was able to interview her in Los Angeles. And I just thought I was going to get the opportunity to interview her, which I did, and it was wonderful. But she then pulled out these boxes, and included were her mother's scrapbooks. And so here, let me again show that.
Oh my
that,
goodness,
okay,
that's great.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
That is.
So you can see the cork cover has degraded, but there in her own handwriting is her script, and it was just chock full. She was very entrepreneurial, very invested also in her own legacy, right? I think she sometimes had tension with some of the other early founders of the league. And I think she had a sense that she might be written out of the history a little bit. But she also was very invested in maintaining her place in that history. And she kept an archive for herself. And so in it also, we have, let me just share again. This is an example of a particularly well done page where she shows, right, I mean, she's really laid this out in a kind of scrapbook style. A lot of them, it was more like the National Mahjong or the Mahjong Sales Company scrapbooks, where it was more of a just clippings. But here she actually has it spread out, has taken apart the title, and wonderfully kept that identifying information, which is so important in actually trying to reconstruct a historical record. And because I want to honor the people who also shared their time with me, I'll actually share with you a picture of Marjorie from that visit.
Wow.
Oh,
She
that's
deserves to
That's
be
nice.
recognized as well.
That's
So I just so appreciate her generosity. Now, anytime you deal with personal papers, you're also dealing with someone's own narrative, right? The perception of themselves, the perception that they want to pass down to people, the perception that they want to project to the world. And so that's always really useful, really important. But it's important then in my own analysis to understand and again seek alternative perspectives. What were other pieces of evidence also telling me? So any piece of evidence has its own, is coming from a specific context, it's coming from a specific author. So we always integrate that in our analysis of really trying to understand as accurate a picture as possible. And Dorothy Meyerson, I talk about her quite a bit in the book. She definitely played a really important role.
Did her daughter play Mahjong? Because I know Babcock's son didn't.
Yeah, John actually posted that he played with her. John Davis just
John
posted.
Davis played with Dorothy's daughter or Dorothy?
Yeah. And I'm going to be writing to Marjorie again and checking in. And I see Katie Albert's question here.
Yeah.
These are her scrapbooks. So I don't know what her plan is with them, but I will let her know that there are safe homes if she wants to find a home for them. And I hope she's doing well. I haven't been in touch with her for a while, so I'll be writing her very soon to let her know the book is out.
So on Facebook Mahjong community for a while now, we just absolutely love the old ads, so when you referenced the Jello ad, I had to search for it and found that, and just love the styling of it. And it shows the undercurrent of the politics of the time. It's just amazing.
Right.
And one of them that I have not found yet, but that you referenced, was the cartoon, that Guiltiest Feeling, when you said
yeah.
the man was so the neighbor invited them to play mahjong, and the man was put to tears because he didn't know how to play. So I was searching for that one.
That's my husband. My husband's so frustrated. Dara's husband gets it. Mine, no, can't.
So one part, an aspect that really shines, is the personal touch and the narrative that you said from people that you spoke to. So I know our good friend Toby, who is on this call, she comes from a long line of mahjong players. And like me, I think she said she was never going to play because it was an old ladies game, but now she's a inspiration to the North California area. So you can share with us a little portion of your interview with her mom.
Yes.
And how old was she when you met with her mom?
Well, you'll hear her on the tape, but she was 95 years old.
Oh, wow.
Just an incredible person. I feel so fortunate to have gotten to meet her and talk with her. Anyone who's taken lessons from Toby or done her, how to be a shark courses knows how special Toby is as well, and what a great instructor she is. But I'm just going to play the first 5 minutes of this audio recording, and it's just audio, there's no visual. And partially that's because I think it is, again, part of what I want to do is also appreciate and honor the people who shared their memories with me. And you get to hear her voice, but also to just give you a sense, again, in this research conversation, give a sense of what the interviews were like, how I often started, right? This is after she and I chatted, but I was in her home, and the home that Toby grew up in. And so I always start with some like identifying information, and you can kind of see how I ask questions, both to draw out a much longer personal history, family history, and also particularly focus on mahjong. So this is just the first 5 minutes of a much longer interview. But I think it gives that sense of information and richness. So bear with me while I just set that up.
Toby,
okay.
Grab a tissue.
Yes, we have lost Riva. Her mother's name is Riva Salk. She lived a long and wonderful life, and I really am grateful to her.
Okay, great. This is Annalise Hines interviewing
Riva Salk
at her home in Glen Oaks, New York. Accurate. And it is May 22nd, 2012.
Right.
So, like I said, I'll ask some mahjong specific questions, and whatever that leads you to. If you think of a story, feel free to share at any time. Take it where you will.
Okay.
And, if you ever need to take a break, I don't want to take up too much of your morning, but if you need to take a break or get tired, just let me know.
Okay.
So if you could just give me just a brief biographical information of, what year were you born, where were you born, and tell me a little bit about your parents. We can start there.
Okay. I'm 95. I was born in Albany, New York, and the reason I was born in Albany, New York is because I lived in a small town, Gloversville, New York, and 95 years ago, they didn't have a hospital there. Everybody had their children at home. My mother's first child was at home and died. The second child, me, she got a neighbor or some friend in the town to drive her to Albany, which was a long drive at that time. They didn't have the highways that they do today. So that's where I was born. I was there for 10 days in the hospital, and then they, of course, took me home. And and I think my sister was born in Albany too. By the time my brother was born, there are 3 children in our family. There was a hospital in Gloversville where he was born. He was born in Gloversville, New York.
Mm-hmm.
And what?
And so which year was that? Sorry.
I was born in 1916.
I could do the math, but I...
Well, it's easier.
Yeah.
1916.
Okay, great. Yeah. And we'll come back to talking about your parents and everything too, but to start with the Mahjong questions, what's your earliest memory of Mahjong? When do you remember seeing it for the first time, or, you know?
Well, of course, I live in New York now, and moved here when I was 18, and didn't move to the island here until I think I was 35. And at that time, that was the only time I started playing Mahjong, is when I had 2 children, and we had time in the afternoon, and it was a popular game in my neighborhood, Floral Park, where I live now. And we never had to take lessons, pay for lessons, the way I hear about it today, that there are Mahjong lessons. We just sort of learned from each other. And I can't even remember that so many years ago how we first started. I had a set. I don't even remember when I got my set, if it was then or must have been later. From my mother. I got my mother's set, Mahjong set. But it seems everybody did have a Mahjong set. Where they got them, if it was handed down, I don't remember a lot of things. Mm-hmm. But it was all in the neighborhood. We used to play at night, and we'd go to each other's homes, and we'd serve coffee and cake. And I think we had 5, mostly, 5 women. Mm-hmm. And it was all Jewish. I don't ever remember having a Gentile woman play with us. It was all Jewish women. Uh-huh. And if we needed an extra player, what we used to do is tack a little note in the laundromat or a supermarket, say, anyone from Mahjong. We put our phone number down, and I don't think we put our address, but we put our phone number. And we did. We got people that would answer that little ad and join us. Yeah. Uh-huh. And that's how we did it for many, many years. And then bridge became my main love, and I started to play bridge and gave up Mahjong and never played again.
Uh-huh. And how did that happen? How did this?
All right, so that gives you a sense of those conversations. And, you know, one of the things that was so interesting too is part of what I was trying to figure out were patterns, right? And so what was an individual story, and what is the meaning I can make, you know, and understand from an individual story, and what can I say are also very strong cultural patterns. And after doing dozens of interviews, it became clear, right? Certain patterns were really important to how people played the game and the culture around the game and how it functioned for them. And so to be able to see those pieces fitting together as an interview after interview after interview was really amazing, and still getting that rich, just utterly individual experience as well. So as we go on, you know, in the conversation, Riva then also returns to some of those earlier questions with additional things that she's remembered that come up over the course of the conversation. That's how part of how oral history works. We jog our memories and we start to remember things that we didn't know we had remembered. And so the story can slightly change over the course of an interview. And indeed, her mother had taught Mahjong as well in the 1920s. So definitely.
You didn't get paid for it, right?
Apparently not, right? I asked her those questions. I have to go back to my notes then and remember what she said. But I don't think so. I think that actually, again, part of the issue also was, you know, were women trying to support themselves, or were they married and then expected there were some issues that were sometimes around married women earning money, right? Was that seen as respectable or not? And I think she was, Toby knows, and I can go back to my notes, but in general, regardless of this general picture, you get a sense of when are women looking for economic opportunities, able to take advantage of opportunities. And that's different from like the National Mahjong League founders, who were wealthy women, definitely being financially supported by their husband's income, but very entrepreneurial, and wanted to start something, wanted to have effectively a business. And that becomes, so they're pouring their time and energy into starting this league, and the money that's coming in then isn't going to pay salaries at that time. That's changed now, but at that time they weren't going to pay salaries. So the money becomes something, if it's more than covering expenses, what do you do with it? Well, that's a tax issue. And if class and respectability and race mean that it's difficult for them to take a salary, and that's not really the point, then, the money can go to philanthropy. And that becomes very quickly a move to philanthropy for the league.
Right, you answered our question. That was perfect, because we were saying the stereotype is Mahjong is older Jewish women, and so then the Mahjong League was created, and they became, very philanthropic, and so that
yes, and it was, it's funny because you read things now where people are saying, like in their 30s, saying, "Oh, I'm picking up Mahjong now. I've got these young kids. Even though I'm not old, I like it. I'm playing." I'm like, but when they were playing it, they weren't old either. I mean, they were also playing as young mothers. That was really part of the point.
Right. Exactly.
Good.
Don't worry about that.
So can you go into, I know in the book you go into much more detail. Can you go into a little more detail of how the Mahjong League came to be?
Yes, absolutely. So as best we can tell, like I said, there were pockets of people who were continuing to play. And one of those people was Dorothy Meyerson. So before the league existed, Dorothy Meyerson began her own business. And she wrote her own rule book called That's It. And she sold her first rule book as a fundraiser for her local synagogue. And she was really, again, wanting to start this effectively a business, and she was making money from it, right? It wasn't kind of seen as a business venture, because she would then talk to the press about how she was this, careful mother, and that's how they portrayed her. But it was a business, and she had sales agents going out across the country trying to drum up interest in this game with the tweaks that she had made. So today's version of the league's game is very different from the version that Meyerson first started in the late 1930s, and that the league then picks up and continues to tweak and change. That really doesn't stabilize until the 1960s. So it's this long period of experimentation and change. But at the time, she and other people who then reached out, most notably Viola Cecil, who became the president of the league, she contacts Meyerson, says, "Let's join forces here. We believe that this is a quality game and it needs to be streamlined." And that was a new word in the 1930s, just like Art Deco aesthetic of the 1920s, it's streamline aesthetic of the 1930s. And again, a further kind of vision of simplifying some of these complicated scoring. That's what Babcock first tries to simplify. It gets simplified further in this version. And a move toward creating certain set hands rather than a much larger variety of winning combinations of tiles, and then how you win is based on the scoring. So the strategy in Chinese Mahjong is really about the scoring, and it's complicated. so what Meyerson is trying to promote is her version of the game, and it's working. It is spreading, and at the same time, she's not the only person doing this. So there's this Oklahoma bank that's actually creating a similar type. It's not clear. We don't know. We just simply don't know at this time with the evidence. If somebody finds a smoking gun, let me know. But how parallel they were to Meyerson, how much they actually were inspired by Meyerson, I don't know. But their version becomes the inspiration for Wright-Patterson Mahjong. And Viola Cecil has a particularly great location in Essex House, right off Central Park, right? Beautiful, luxurious residential hotel. She's living there. She coordinates then with Meyerson and a few other people to send out a call. We are starting a national Mahjong league. Interested parties should come. And more than 200 people show up. But they had expected 100. 200 people show up, and they are excited and they're passionate. And people have been playing, and it's largely Jewish women. People had been playing, and they had been playing according to table rules and lots of variations. And so this is a vision of, we are going to standardize and bring people together, and it's going to rejuvenate a game that has fallen out of favor because it is too fractured, because there are too many different versions. We're going to bring this all together and launch a new game. And that indeed they do.
That's great.
Very interesting.
So let's see.
Yeah, we were just talking about, references to Mahjong in media.
So on Facebook, and then as well on our YouTube channel, we do something, we call it Fun Mahjong Find Friday. And whenever we see newspaper articles, TV shows, movies, we record a little glimpse, bit of it, or we take photos of it, and then we share it. Do you feel like there's been an uptick lately in seeing Mahjong in popular culture?
Yes, I think so. And I think we're definitely living in a time of Mahjong renaissance, and a diversification of the game and the styles of game and who's playing what, and a diversification of interest. Anytime there's a big budget Hollywood film about that Mahjong, that features Mahjong, that also goes a long way. Thus far, although there have been other mentions as well, including Lust Caution, there was the two big budget Hollywood films that focus on that highlight Mahjong in key ways are The Joy Luck Club, and then 25 years later, Crazy Rich Asians. And in both cases, you see an uptick in references to Mahjong by media, by people explicitly saying, I want to learn this game now because of the way that it was featured in the film. And in fact, in Joy Luck Club, which is about Chinese American families and mother-daughter relationships, there's a line in it in which one of the mothers refers to, quote, Jewish Mahjong. And she says, Chinese Mahjong is trickier. And I know also what she's really talking about is the scoring is different, but anyway, that reference, I have multiple people who were younger Jewish American women who did not grow up surrounded by the game in the 50s and 60s, right? They was a the generation after the, children of baby boomers, in other words. And they're like, what? I'm Jewish, that's important to me. I want to know about this. And they go out and learn the game because of this reference from a Chinese American film. And so there are diverse ways that shows up. But I do think we're definitely seeing an uptick in interest and references. Yeah.
And it's interesting because the Mahjong scene, we actually did a post about it. It wasn't in the book, and the significance, right. I don't want to ruin it for anybody who hasn't seen the movie, so it's a major spoiler. Yeah. But the way that she plays the game and how she plays it is in line with the whole plot of the movie. So it's amazing how I didn't know what they were doing because I don't play that style of Mahjong, but if you did, you really got a bigger grasp of it. So the article that goes over it was great.
Yes, Jeff Yang's article that was eventually printed in Vox was really great breakdown. Yeah, it was awesome.
If anyone's interested, on our YouTube channel, Modern Mahjong, we share all these scenes and videos and books, and it's, as Dara said, fun Friday, and we love fun. And I just found one in Netflix, so it's actually not an English series, and so it was interesting to see it. So we're going to post that hopefully next week. So speaking of all this with the older generation, younger generation, what do you think the future of Mahjong is going to be?
I hope it's bright. I do. I mean, I think that there are a number of areas of change that are interesting to track. And like we just talked about, there's definitely an increase in interest. I think, and that's good. If you care about the game, that's a good thing. I think that as we're seeing, there's increased diversification. I think that that's interesting, right? Because the way that plays out will probably take really individual forms. I think that there is an important place for people to be able to connect over a shared experience, a shared social experience, as a kind of safe space. And I hope that Mahjong games remain that for people who are looking for that. And also it's really, I think, positive and valuable to have increased crossover and changes in who is coming together at a table. I think we see that as in retirement communities, especially. Those are becoming places where people are really, men are coming to a game with mostly Jewish women, when that really did not happen in the 1950s and 60s. And again, it was important for the women that was a women-only space. So hopefully those who, again, want that can also create that for themselves. I think that the game, as it continues to evolve in multiple strands and in multiple variants, I think one question is, what keeps this game, as it continues to change in various ways, recognizable as a form of Mahjong? And so there was a recent controversy over a tile company that was changing the tile designs. They're not the only ones to do that. They were not the first ones to do that. But it is a recent thing that it's happening more frequently to have American Mahjong sets really change so that they're actually not just different images, but different patterns, that the patterns are not recognizable as like the lines of the bamboo or the clear dots. And that's reflective in part of a fundamentally different way of playing the game that's drawing from American Mahjong. And so I think one open question is, if we get to the point where the sets have continued to change so much that they are not recognizable as Mahjong sets, is that actually a fundamentally different game? If you can't sit down and play the same game and it doesn't look the same, when does it actually evolve into something different? And I think that we don't know that answer yet. I think that there is, for me, as someone who's really attached to this game as something that feels cohesive, that crosses boundaries, but yet retains its core similarities, there would be a loss for that for me. But it's also, again, games evolve, and so I think we will see. So there are like multiple open question marks. I think one of the things we also saw in that conversation was for Asian Americans, Mahjong is highlighted once again as a place of a shared experience, including a shared experience of cultural erasure. And we're living in a moment right now of a real increase in anti-Asian violence. And Mahjong has, within Asian American communities, Mahjong has played a really important role of fostering a sense of togetherness that is also a part of American culture, but very much rooted in a sense of heritage. And so I hope that also continues. At the same time that I hope the increased conversation around an awareness of an interest in Asian culture and Asian American cultures in our contemporary Mahjong communities learns from the past and does not just replicate a 1920s approach, which was rooted in a more ignorant era of a kind of superficial taking of ideas rather than a genuine engagement, and really, again, using that to learn about contemporary Asian American people and cultures, and not just an idea of a far off, misty place.
Well, one really great example of a positive is the street fair that you mentioned that we had done a post about.
Yes.
Empanadas and mahjong, it's
Yeah.
all different cultures. And just since we saw there was a an Instagram post of just a beautiful drawing of a young woman playing with her grandmother. And it was
Yes.
so beautiful. And we shared it and it inspired us. We, even before that, to Stop Asian Hate was our most recent charity that we donated for our last tournament.
That's awesome.
So that was just a way of honoring the tradition. And what's so interesting is before Donna and I read the book, your aunt's question of what makes it a Jewish game, I just always feel that the Asian community, and I grew up in New York, the Jewish community, it always did seem very intersected. So to me, and you mentioned this in the book, a lot of people assume, well, Jewish people have Chinese food on Sunday nights and on Christmas Eve, that maybe that's part of it. So it was so nice to dive into understanding the actual. So that being said, other stereotypes are that in China, it's men that play, and in America, it's Jewish women. So we've had a few questions recently
the men
in the
are
chat
really
of
left out.
why are men not playing?
And I feel like during the pandemic, especially and through our Facebook group, Mahjong Community, a lot of women have taught their husbands to play because they were stuck in the house. And men have really enjoyed it. I think the advent, Amy, I see Amy's husband waving. A lot of men are now learning because of the pandemic and because of the advent of Siamese Mahjong that Gladys Gratt came up with, 2 people can play. So it's a really wonderful thing. And also during the pandemic, we saw mothers teaching their children, young children, and the grandmother is maybe in their bubble and teaching them. So the pandemic has really, as you said, social interaction, but I think a lot more men are playing. I mean, we have a lot of men on this call, and I think it's wonderful. I really
and
do.
Intergenerationally, I've seen a lot of people saying, my kids are playing with me now, right? Because you're just in the house together, and so in a totally different way. And I do think that's been interesting, and I think it says something, right? That people have had to do so much virtual play. And yes, you can play the game fortunately now with these technological innovations, but so many people are like, yeah, I want to go back, right, to my in-person group. It's different. It is that very, very special connection. And I think that's one of the things that makes Mahjong special, is that deep social element that, yes, you can play it just as a game, but the way that it fosters certain kinds of interactions is especially strong, and especially in person. And I just want to add, Sydney Fox added to the comments, thank you. Yes, the Eldridge Street Museum is the one that hosts that street fair that we were talking about. And I'll actually be giving a virtual talk. It'll be more of like a lecture style talk with them during this time of festival soon, in June. So I'll be sure to post about that. But yes, they are a really great resource. They're based in the Lower East Side.
It's called egg rolls, egg cream, and empanadas.
Yes. and they host like Mahjong tables there during the festival when it's in person. This year
somebody was just mentioning the Tiles That Bind. And then also we shared your video when you were on the panel with Toby of the movie that's coming out, the Mahjong game. So hopefully when that's getting back to post-COVID, hopefully that'll be another Zoom talk that we do with the producer and the actress in that.
Awesome. So. Yeah, The Tiles That Bind is a wonderful short film. Really highly recommend it. And you can, some libraries have it. You can purchase it still. So yeah.
That's great. So I'm just scanning now the chat. I know somebody earlier on said, what happened to Mahjong in China during, and I lost what they said. Was it during
the Cultural Revolution?
Yeah.
Revolution, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to pause. I realize I forgot your earlier question in terms of the gender dynamic in China, but both men and women play it in China. That is a widely held misconception. Both men and women play it in China today. They play it in single sex groups. They play it in mixed sex groups. Family members play it. It's played in a diversity of ways, and it can be played for very high stakes as a gambling game. In that case, all mostly male, but not only. And it can be played for pennies with grandmothers and grandchildren and grandfathers. So I wanted to get back to that question. So Yeah, so the Cultural Revolution, it's interesting tracking the game's history in 20th century China is it's not clear because of that spectrum of when it can be both a gambling game and not a gambling game. And so actually across Asia, you see it crop up as a question of, is this a problem? Is this not? In Japan, it's a much more likely to be part of a much more competitive, much more gambling oriented culture of Riichi. And so Japanese politicians sometimes get in trouble for playing mahjong because it is so strongly associated with gambling. That happened recently in Taiwan. There was a huge scandal in Taiwan around a politician who had said he doesn't gamble, and then he was filmed playing mahjong. In China, in the 1930s, with the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, they cracked down on gambling in certain forms, but mahjong is not clear. So they make a rule that says, well, you can't play it in public, but you can play it in private. And we're going to assume that like a home-based mahjong is not gambling. What that effectively does, as there, just as here, is that it effectively criminalizes poorer people who are playing it in public because they don't have the same access to private space. But that's reflective of, again, this kind of tension. Mao also had a complicated relationship with mahjong. He is quoted as saying, you can't understand the Chinese people or Chinese culture if you don't play mahjong. At the same time, any activities related to kind of seemingly corrupt or corruptive culture were verboten. And with mahjong, it had long been discussed as indicative of traditional aspects of Chinese culture. And in fact, many of the images that you see on like the flower tiles are based in Confucian era symbolism. So the messages in the images are attached to Confucian values and Confucian teaching. And the Cultural Revolution was about smashing Confucianism. It was about smashing the past and creating a radical new future led by the peasant proletariat. And so Confucianism is hierarchical, right? So that's anti this radical Maoist vision. And so I think it was probably targeted for that reason, as well as being a kind of leisure activity, and you should be putting all your energy into the nation. The notion that the Cultural Revolution destroyed some kind of archive that would have otherwise existed of mahjong history is probably not true. And in fact, it's just not so complicated. The 20th century had repeated upheavals in China, much more damaging in some ways probably to some of that earlier records in history was the Japanese invasion and bombing of Shanghai. And so that, as the heart of that early history of mahjong. So this was not the focus of my research since I really was situated in the United States and thinking in trans-Pacific terms and following that. But especially when we get into the 1970s, which is the tail end of my book, and especially if we're talking about China, I think there's a lot. I want to be clear. I do not know as much as I know about the other stuff, but I see books as a beginning of conversations, not the end of them. So I hope someone else takes up that research and proves me wrong and, actually does that hunt because it would be great to learn more.
Well, I know from tonight, if your university offered a mahjong class with you speaking and we could all virtually join it, you would have a very full classroom.
Well,
I feel like I should get partial credit now for learning history tonight.
Yeah, so
but this has been...
Your book's available now, I was going to say. Where can people buy it?
Yes, well, thank you for asking. I don't know if it would make sense for me to put my website address into the chat or if one of you wants to. But my website is kind of one-stop shop for all links related to writing I've done, including the book, and it includes multiple places of where you can buy the book. If you just want to click on one link, I can copy and paste right now, like Amazon and IndieBound are the two that people tend to prefer.
Yeah, but you could, if you tell us yours, I'll type it in.
I mean, if I have a say, I'd say IndieBound or any local bookstores is my preference if you can,
Yeah, and I think, again, it's what the publisher says is, we don't promote any one over the other. It's really what people want to do. And so let me put in the IndieBound link here, and then I'll get you this Amazon link here.
And the title, it's Mahjong, a Chinese game in the making of modern American culture.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I've said it so many times. I just wanted to and your website, just in case people want your website.
Yes. Let me just grab that. Thank you for these great interests. Okay.
Well, we're already getting emails and messages about how wonderful it is. So.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Thank you.
I don't want bookstores to go away. So I worked in in high school. I worked in Doubleday Bookstore in Bal Harbour Shops, in Florida. And my high school friend owns Books and Books in Coral Gables. Yep. And it's a wonderful bookstore. And I just want to keep supporting bookstores.
So we're going to call out for any other questions. I know we answered that. If not, we are going to thank Annalise so much for being so generous. So I know we went over, but we didn't want to cut anything off. We were enjoying the talk.
Well, I appreciate all of you who stuck with it. So thank you.
We just want to quickly say we have some upcoming events. We're having a virtual trivia night on Wednesday, May 5th at 7 p.m. We're going to have special guests Michelle Frizzell and Debbie Barnett speaking for about 15 minutes because they're actually doing a MajCon October 10th through 11th in Orlando, Florida. Dara will be there. I cannot. I have a family wedding in New York, but that's on Wednesday, May 5th. And then we have another virtual vintage on Wednesday, May 12th at 7 p.m. And those have been wonderful. You're going to see Mahjong sets that you will never see again. We have some wonderful guests and some beautiful sets. So we hope you can join us.
And then we are continuing our online tournaments. Since the beginning of COVID, we've been doing them. And every month we started with Alzheimer's. And that was our first charity. We have May 20th through the 24th, either a 4 or 8 round tournament. And what's new now is now that in some areas and vaccinated, some people are playing in person, you could take our score sheet and play in person and then submit your scores, or you continue playing online. So if you enjoy playing in your sweatpants, that's great. We can keep doing that. And that's May. The charity is the American Heart Association. And then June, I think it's our 12th tournament. We're back to the Alzheimer's Association again. And that is June 24th through 28th. So we really have been enjoying doing these Zoom talks, learning, connecting all of us. I thought it was such a compliment when a friend who plays Mahjong with, virtually with us said that she feels like these are just like an evening at a friend's house. So that's why we just love this Zoom atmosphere. Thank you everybody for all your compliments. We appreciate it. And if you missed it and you came in late, don't worry, you will be able to catch it from the beginning. We will share the link on Facebook and then on YouTube as well. So once again, Annalise, thank you so much. Best of luck with everything.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to being in touch one way or another.
Oh, wait, one more thing I forgot. If you go to our Facebook and you comment, I watched, we are giving away 5 book plates that Annalise is going to sign and mail to people. So we are giving away 5 people that already typed I registered, and then we're going to give away 5 more to people that watch the Zoom replay. So,
and anybody, tell me who you want me to write it to or any little note.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you.